Okay, everybody, make sure you have your note sheet out. We're taking a look at the topic that we started in class today, which is farmers and the movement of populism. Ultimately, the question we want you to be able to answer is what led to the rise of populism and what effect did it have? The first thing that you need to be aware of is that directly after the Civil War, millions of men and women migrated west in search of the American dream, and this is usually found by claiming one's own piece of land. On this map that you see here, not only does it show transcontinental railroad paths, but it also shows federal land grants. So the land grants, which are shown in this pink color, if you take a look at any or most of the railroad routes that go from east to west, north to south, is where you would see those land grants be given. And this came in the form of the Homestead Act, which gave someone, upon application, roughly 160 acres of land. Usually it was the railroads that were the largest landowners and beneficiaries of this, but other people did benefit as well, primarily small farmers. However, in the late 1880s and early 1990s, the dream of these farmers began to turn into a nightmare, which started a revolt and a political movement later known as populism. What populism displayed was a dissatisfaction of millions of ordinary Americans, poor farmers, landowners, urban workers, and ultimately produced one of the largest third-party movements in American history. Some of the problems of farmers moving west, obviously we know about the cheap land that the Homestead Act offered, but some blamed the railroads that linked east to west as part of the problem, and we'll examine that in a little bit. The first problem that I really want to take a look at in a little bit more in depth is the price of goods. While this is a chart that is showing the price of wholesale wheat flour from 1865 to 1890, and you can see that given by increments of every 5 years, it was fluctuating but ultimately going down over that course of time. Other crops such as cotton sold for about 15 cents a pound in the 1870s, but by the 1890s was selling for about 6 cents per pound. Corn farmers found that it was almost more beneficial to burn their corn and use it as fuel as opposed to selling it. At the same time, the cost of doing business rose. To pay for new machinery, seed, livestock, and other needs, farmers paid on credit and went into debt. Many mortgaged their farms to raise funds to survive and became tenant farmers that no longer owned the farm that they worked. Many thought this technology would lead to greater production, which did, but because of an oversupply of crops, the demand did not match, and that led to falling prices. As the prices drops, the burden of debt grows, and farmers began to cultivate more wheat or cotton or hay, whatever they're growing, to raise the same amount of money. When we take a look at the big business practice that hurt farmers, many farmers blamed railroads and banks for their difficulties. Some blamed the monopolistic railroad corporations would change rates whenever they wanted. Now, obviously, you're taking a look at this same map that I showed you previously, but given that many of the federal land grants that were given are nearby railroads, some felt that especially in the Great Plains, that the railroads, being the largest landowners, could offer rates of whatever they wanted. So farmers resented these high rates that existed in the farm regions because they had no alternative form of transportation. They also complained that banks were setting interest rates at ridiculously high levels. So in a situation where one had to take out a loan for whether it be machinery, more land, something related to their crop, what they would have to pay those loans back and the interest upon it was almost a bigger burden than they could originally afford to pay. Unpredictable harvests due to bugs and bad weather also led to failure and eventually foreclosures where banks repossessed farms, so there really was not much in the way of sympathy on the behalf of these banks. Ultimately, farmers were growing more and more angry, feeling that the nation was turning its back on them in favor of industry. So while there was a history of electing presidents who had agricultural backgrounds, so thinking back to Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson, both from primarily agricultural states, the Gilded Age started to bring in presidents who were from more urban industrial states, such as Grover Cleveland, who was from New Jersey, Chester A. Arthur, who was a West Coast man himself from Vermont. A very significant quote there we will lead into what we're talking about next comes from a group known as the Farmers Alliance, stated that there are three crops raised in Nebraska. One is the crop of corn, one is the crop of freight rates, and one is a crop of interest. One is produced by farmers who sweat and toil to farm the land. The other two are produced by men who sit in their offices behind their bank counters and farm the farmers. So think of it in a sense that there are groups of people who are taking advantage of the farmers from the farmers' perspective. Farmers ultimately felt that they performed honest labor. However, it was the bankers and the businessmen that were getting rich. They realized that some form of social change could provoke by demonstration of power and power relay in numbers. So as a result of these grievances that farmers were having, they took action. And the first way that farmers organized and sought to create change was by forming a network of organizations to address their problem. Among the very first was known as the Granger Movement. And essentially the Granger Movement was a network of farmers' organizations created to address the common problems that they were having. It was initially organized by a man by the name of Oliver H. Kelly in 1867, and what came to be known as the Grange attracted over 1 million members. Ultimately, the goal of the Grange was to provide education on new farming techniques, call for government regulation of railroad and warehouses, and they found some success in the states of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, who created laws that set a maximum on rates for shipping and for grain storage. By the 1870s, the grain started to decline, but as a result of this, farmers' alliances started to develop. And these alliances cooperated to collectively sell their crops and called on government to establish banks to provide farmers with low interest loans in hopes of driving the cost of business down, but driving the crop prices up. They offered social and recreational opportunities, and they also emphasized political action. They saw collective action, all farmers that is, as a way of to seek relief from the hardships created by chronic debt, declining prices, and devastating droughts. A direct result of this is the creation of what came to be known as the Populist Party, or the People's Party. The platform of the main ideas of the Populist Party warned farmers of political corruption that existed at the time as a result of the development of corporations and their influence upon government, an inadequate monetary supply, and a government that was unresponsive to the needs of the farmers. To fight the low crop prices, they called for what we have a free silver program, otherwise known as the coinage of silver. At the time, there was about 3 different types of currency that existed: greenbacks, otherwise as paper money, national banknotes, and hard money in the form of gold or silver certificates. When we had metallic currency, this dated all the way back to about 1792, and it authorized unlimited coinage of silver and gold at a ratio of 15 to 1. Another issue that was on the party platform was that in order to combat the high cost of transporting goods, they demanded that government ownership of railroad, the telephone and telegraph system be enacted, a gradual income tax be put in place, the 8-hour workday, and restriction of immigration. And while the Populist Party had a presidential candidate, that is James B. Weaver of Iowa in 1892, they didn't win the election. But what Weaver did is win more than 1 million votes, and as a result, numerous populists were actually elected to Congress. In order to be successful in future elections, populists had to unite white and black individuals alike to convince urban factory workers that they and the farmers were sharing a common enemy, being the industrial elite. A year after the election, in 1893, a 4-year-long depression began to worsen the condition of farmers and urban workers. By about 1894, there was over 750,000 people who went on strike, including the Pullman workers. Millions of people became unemployed, and railroad construction workers were laid off and even talked upon marching to Washington, D.C. Some did, known as Coxey's Army, which brought upwards of 500 individuals to D.C., but even still their problems were not technically addressed. Then became the issue of the monetary system. 2 parties would form, not quite political parties, but I should say different viewpoints, being the Silverites, those who favored a free silver, or the coinage of silver, and gold bugs, those who favored the gold standard, solely the gold standard. So the mid-1890s put a huge focus on the concern of currency issues. The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, sought to end the issuance of silver notes redeemable in gold. Farmers favored free silver to promote inflation, whereas industrials preferred the gold standard. As populace and urban workers shared the discontent with the two major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, both groups hoped to find that their needs would be met by a different Democratic candidate by the name of William Jennings Bryan. In 1896, he addressed the issue of the gold standard, attacking those in the Democratic Party who opposed coining silver. And in this 3-hour speech, known as the Cross of Gold speech, which he gave at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, he ended the speech by saying, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor, that with this crown of thorns, that you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And like I said, that speech hence came to be known as the Cross of Gold speech. That 3-hour speech moved the Democratic delegates so much that they nominated Bryan as the party's presidential candidate. His advocacy of free silver earned the support of Populists. He was the youngest presidential candidate to this date. He was 36, or to the date at the time, was 36 years old. His campaign was not like any before, in that for the first time, he was a presidential candidate who toured the nation and spoke directly to the people. His opposition, William McKinley, didn't do the same thing, but he actually accumulated about $15 million in campaign funds, or about 30 times as much as William Jennings Bryan. And McKinley supported the gold standard platform. By election day, before I go to that, I want to show you this. These are actually two pins that would support either political party. Obviously, the one on the top with William Jennings Bryan, and on the bottom, William McKinley, but if you notice, in the form of bugs, and on the wings would be both the candidates. But on the very top one with William Jennings Bryan, opposite where he is the ratio of silver to gold 16-1 in support of it. So like I said, by election day, McKinley won the popular vote fairly handily, 7.1 million to about 6.5 million, and the Electoral College by 271 to 176. In fact, William Jennings Bryan did not carry a single state just because there's so much division within the party. But it did leave a pretty important legacy. I'm showing you here the election map of 1900, which brought together those two candidates, William McKinley for the Republicans and William Jennings Bryan for the Democrats in 1900, and with a similar outcome of the election in terms of the victory. But what you need to be aware of is that in 1900, Congress passed a Gold Standard Act, which marked the end of a silver movement. Bryan's emphasis on the monetary platform, especially free silver, did not appeal to urban workers. The Populist Party lingered for nearly a decade before it had disappeared from the national stage, and even though it fell apart, reforms that Populists supported would become a reality in the 20th century. Things such as a graduated income tax, regulation of the railroad, and a more flexible monetary system, as well as Bryan's campaign style that would catch on, as candidates would speak directly to the people, emphasizing their association with ordinary Americans.